The courtroom went completely silent after his lawyer said it. Not the polite kind of silence either, the heavy kind, the kind where even the air seems to stop moving. My ex-husband Greg was still smiling when the words left his lawyer's mouth. Then the smile slowly disappeared. "Greg," the man whispered, leaning toward him, voice tight with panic, "you didn't inherit $1 million. You just signed for nearly $1 million in debt." Greg blinked. Once. Twice. Like someone who had just been hit by a truck but hadn't felt the pain yet. Across the courtroom, I sat beside my attorney, Linda Chavez, hands folded calmly in my lap. 23 years of marriage had led to that moment. And Greg still hadn't realized the one simple truth. He had asked for everything. And I had given it to him. Exactly as he wanted. The whole thing really started 6 months earlier on a cold Tuesday evening in Cedar Rapids. I remember the smell of garlic bread in the oven and the soft hum of the dishwasher. Nothing unusual, just another weeknight in our house on Maple Grove Drive. I was standing at the counter slicing tomatoes for salad when Greg walked into the kitchen. He didn't kiss me hello. He didn't ask about dinner. He just pulled out a chair, sat down, and started buttering a piece of toast like he had all the time in the world. Something about the quiet felt wrong. "Ellen," he said finally. I turned toward him. "Yeah." He didn't look angry, didn't look sad either. Just calm. "I think it's time we talk about a divorce." The knife slipped from my fingers and hit the cutting board with a sharp metallic sound. For a moment, I just stared at him. After 23 years of marriage, that's how he said it. Like he was discussing changing the cable plan. "A divorce," I repeated. Greg nodded and took a bite of toast. "I've been thinking about it for a while." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly. Our kitchen clock ticked on the wall behind him. Tick, tick, tick. "What brought this on?" I asked. Greg shrugged. "I'm tired, Ellen. I want something different, a simpler life." That word stuck with me. Simpler. Different how? Well, he wiped crumbs from his fingers. "I've already talked to a lawyer." That was the moment my stomach dropped. Because men don't talk to lawyers unless the decision is already made. He leaned back in the chair. "We can keep this easy if we're smart about it." I waited. Greg looked around the kitchen like he was already evaluating the place as property instead of a home. "I'll take the house," he said. "The retirement accounts, the savings. Both cars probably make sense too." He said it so casually it almost sounded like he was dividing leftovers. Then he took another bite of toast. "You can keep Daniel," he added. I blinked. "What?" Greg waved a hand like it was nothing. "I mean custody. Teenagers cost a fortune. I'm not looking to raise a 15-year-old on my own." Our son Daniel was upstairs finishing homework. The house suddenly felt colder. "You don't want your son?" I asked quietly. Greg sighed like I was being difficult. "It's not like that. He'll still see me. I just don't want the responsibility full-time." I sat there staring at the man I'd spent half my life with. For 23 years I had filed our taxes, paid every bill, tracked every savings account, remembered every birthday in both families. Greg liked to joke with his coworkers that I was the family accountant. He made the money. I kept things organized. Or at least that's what he believed. Greg finished his toast and stood up. "If we keep this friendly," he said, "the lawyers won't eat everything." Then he added something that still makes my jaw tighten when I remember it. "Besides, Ellen, you're not really the fighting type." Upstairs, I heard Daniel's bedroom door close. Greg walked out of the kitchen and went to watch television like we'd just discussed grocery shopping. I stayed at the table. For a long time. 3 days later, I met Linda Chavez. Her office sat on the second floor of a brick building downtown just off First Avenue. The waiting room smelled faintly like coffee and old paperwork. Linda was in her early 50s with sharp eyes and short dark hair. She read through Greg's proposed settlement without speaking. Finally, she set the papers down and leaned back in her chair. "Ellen, are you sure this is real?" "What do you mean?" "He wants the house, the retirement accounts, most of the savings, both vehicles, and primary control of the investment portfolio." "That's what he asked for." Linda rubbed her forehead. "If we fight this in court, you could walk away with half of everything, possibly more." I folded my hands in my lap. "I know." Linda studied me carefully. "So we'll counter." I shook my head. "Number." She frowned. "No. I'm going to give him what he wants. For a second, she thought I was joking. Then she realized I wasn't. Ellen, she said slowly, this is the worst negotiation strategy I've ever heard. Maybe? Your husband is asking for almost 90% of the assets. I understand. Linda stared at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Why would you do that? I thought about Greg sitting in our kitchen calmly dividing our life like inventory. And I remembered the folders sitting in my desk drawer at home. Mortgage statements. Loan documents. Credit card balances. One very specific line of credit Greg assumed I knew nothing about. Because I said quietly sometimes the fastest way to win is to stop arguing. Linda tapped her pen against the desk. You're either very patient, she said, or very reckless. I smiled slightly. Let's find out which one. Greg moved out 2 weeks later. He packed a single suitcase and a box of clothes. Nothing sentimental. No photo albums. No old birthday cards from Daniel. Just shirts, shoes, and his laptop. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen. Try not to make this ugly, Ellen. I won't, I said. Greg nodded like he expected that answer. He picked up his car keys. I think this divorce will work out pretty well for both of us. Then he walked out the front door. I listened to his car start. Watched the headlights pass across the living room window. And then the house went quiet. A few minutes later, Daniel came downstairs. He looked toward the empty hallway. Dad leave? Yes. Daniel leaned against the counter. He coming back. I took a breath. Number. Daniel nodded once. Teenagers don't always ask the questions you expect. After a moment, he said, Are we going to lose the house? I looked around the kitchen. The cabinets I'd repainted myself. The dent in the floor where Daniel dropped his first bike when he was 7. And I thought about the financial paperwork I had studied for months. No, I said. We're not losing anything important. Daniel didn't fully understand what I meant. But someday he would. Because Greg had just walked away believing he had already won. And the truth was, he had no idea what he had actually taken. The first quiet morning after Greg moved out felt strange. Not peaceful, just unfamiliar. For 23 years, our mornings had followed the same rhythm. Greg showered at 6:30, the coffee maker rattled to life at 6:40, and by 7 he was out the door complaining about traffic on Interstate 380. That Wednesday morning, the house stayed silent. I woke before the alarm anyway, habit. The sky outside the bedroom window was pale gray, the kind of early fall morning Cedar Rapids gets when summer is letting go, but winter hasn't quite arrived yet. For a moment, I forgot everything. Then I noticed the empty side of the bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning overhead. 23 years of marriage reduced to an empty pillow. But oddly enough, I didn't cry. Instead, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Bills. Mortgage. Utilities. Car insurance. I wrote everything down like I'd done every month for 2 decades. Greg used to joke that I treated our finances like library records. Ellen, nobody keeps spreadsheets for their life. Maybe not. But I did. And those spreadsheets were the reason I wasn't panicking. Daniel came downstairs around 7. His hair stuck out in 3 different directions and he looked half asleep. Morning, he muttered. Morning. He opened the refrigerator and stared inside like the milk might attack him. Dad texted, he said finally. What did he say? Daniel shrugged. Just said he got his apartment, downtown somewhere. That sounded about right. Greg had always liked the idea of city living. Bars within walking distance, new restaurants, the illusion of starting over. Daniel poured cereal and sat across from me. Mom, he said after a minute. Yeah. Are you really giving Dad everything? The question hung in the air. I took a sip of coffee before answering. Pretty much. Daniel frowned. That seems unfair. You're not wrong. He pushed his spoon around the bowl. Then why do it? I studied my son for a moment. 15 years old, tall already, shoulders starting to broaden. He had Greg's dark hair. But the kindness in his eyes came from somewhere else. Sometimes, I said slowly, people make decisions that seem smart in the moment. Daniel waited. And sometimes I continued those decisions come back later. He tilted his head. That sounds like a riddle. I smiled slightly. Maybe it is. Daniel didn't push further. Teenagers have a way of sensing when an adult is holding something back. Instead, he finished his cereal, grabbed his backpack, and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. "You okay, Mom?" "I'm okay." He studied my face like he was deciding whether to believe me. Then he nodded once and left for school. The house fell quiet again. Later that afternoon, I opened the drawer in my desk. Inside were several folders. Not secret ones. Just organized ones. Greg never paid attention to paperwork. He hated reading financial statements and always handed that responsibility to me. "Numbers make my head hurt," he used to say. Which was unfortunate for him. Because numbers tell stories. And Greg's story had been getting messy for a while. I pulled out a folder labeled Home Equity Line of Credit. HELOC. Most homeowners know what that means. It's basically a loan you take against the value of your house. The bank says your home is worth $600,000. You owe $300,000 on the mortgage. That leaves $300,000 in equity. A HELOC lets you borrow against that equity. It can be helpful, or it can become a disaster. Greg had opened our HELOC 2 years earlier. At first, the withdrawals were small. $10,000, $15,000. Then the amounts grew. $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. I discovered it by accident during tax season. Greg had forgotten to log out of his email on the home computer. Bank notifications started appearing. At first, I assumed he was renovating something. Then I saw the transaction locations. Prairie Meadows Casino, Altoona, Iowa. Again, and again, and again. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Over 18 months, Greg withdrew nearly $240,000. Most of it disappeared into gambling losses and speculative investments. The house on Maple Grove Drive still looked valuable from the outside. But financially, it was carrying a massive weight. Mortgage balance about $320,000. HELOC debt $240,000. Add in several credit cards Greg had opened without mentioning. The house wasn't the treasure Greg thought it was. It was a ticking financial bomb. And Greg had just insisted on owning it. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Part of me had wanted to confront him months ago. But another part of me, the practical part that had kept our family afloat for years, realized something important. Greg didn't want a conversation. He wanted an exit. And when people are eager to leave, they stop paying attention. That Friday evening, Daniel had a soccer game at Jefferson High. Cold wind blew across the field as parents bundled in jackets and blankets. I sat on the metal bleachers with a cup of hot chocolate from the concession stand. Daniel played midfield, number 12. He ran hard. Always had. Halfway through the second half, he scored on a clean pass from the left side. The crowd cheered. I stood and clapped like every other parent there. For a moment, the divorce disappeared. After the game, Daniel jogged over sweaty and smiling. "You see that goal?" "I did. Coach said it was my best one all season." "You earned it." We walked toward the parking lot together. The wind had picked up and the stadium lights hummed overhead. Daniel kicked a loose pebble along the sidewalk. "Dad didn't come." "Number." "He said he might." "I know." Daniel shrugged. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "You know what's weird?" "What?" "He keeps talking about selling the house." I glanced at him. "When did he say that?" "Yesterday on the phone. He said once the divorce is done, he might sell it and buy a boat." I almost laughed. Greg always liked the image of boat ownership. He'd mentioned it at least once every summer for the past decade. "What did you say?" I asked. Daniel shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "I said boats are expensive." That made me smile. "Yes, they are." Daniel stopped walking. "Mom, if Dad sells the house, where will we live?" I looked across the parking lot at the rows of cars under the stadium lights. Then I looked back at my son. "We'll live somewhere smaller," I said. "Somewhere quieter." Daniel nodded slowly. Then he said something simple. "As long as we're together, I guess it doesn't matter." That was the moment I knew everything would be fine. 2 days later, Greg called the house. I answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said cheerfully. "Hi. How's Daniel?" "He scored a goal Friday." "Good for him." There was a brief pause. Then Greg said, "Listen, once the divorce is finalized, I'm thinking of selling the place." The house. Yeah, market's good right now. I imagined the mortgage statement sitting in my desk drawer. You might want to check the numbers before you do that, I said carefully. Greg laughed. Ellen, I know how real estate works. I almost said something. Almost. Instead, I let the silence sit between us. Well, he continued, once it sells, I might finally get that boat I've always talked about. Maybe? Greg sounded pleased with himself. Honestly, this whole divorce thing might turn out to be the best decision I ever made. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where he'd announced he wanted everything. You might be right, I said. Greg chuckled. I usually am. When the call ended, I sat there for a long moment. Then I reached into the drawer and pulled out another folder. This one was labeled Parker Education Trust. Greg rarely mentioned it, but he assumed it belonged to both of us. That assumption was going to matter soon. Very soon. Greg grew more confident as the weeks passed. You could hear it in his voice every time he called. At first, the conversations were short and polite, updates about Daniel, quick questions about mail that still arrived at the house. But gradually the tone changed. He started sounding proud, like a man who believed he had outplayed someone. One evening, Daniel was upstairs doing homework when Greg called again. Ellen, he said, I just talked to a realtor. Oh, yeah, once everything's finalized, I might list the house right away. Prices are strong right now. That could work, I said. I'm thinking I could walk away with close to $600,000 after the sale. I didn't correct him. He kept talking. And the retirement accounts are solid. I checked them last week. Plus the investments. Greg paused, then added with a little laugh. Honestly, I might retire 5 years early. I leaned against the kitchen counter and listened. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves across the driveway. You've always been good with numbers, Greg said. Thanks. But I guess this time I got there first. I smiled to myself. Greg had always believed that. He thought he understood the financial picture better than I did. He just never looked closely. Good night, Greg, I said. Night. When the call ended, I sat down at the table. Then I opened the folder in front of me. Parker Education Trust. The document inside was dated 14 years earlier. My father had created the trust when Daniel was a baby. My dad had grown up poor in rural Iowa. College had changed his life, and he was determined his grandson would never struggle to afford an education. The trust was simple. Beneficiaries Ellen Parker and Daniel Parker. Purpose education and living expenses for Daniel. Greg's name appeared nowhere on the document. But Greg had always assumed the money belonged to both of us. He never bothered to read the paperwork. That was Greg's biggest weakness. He trusted appearances. 2 days later, I met with a financial planner recommended by Linda Chavez. Her office sat near the Cedar River, a small brick building with wide windows overlooking the water. Her name was Carol Nguyen. Carol read through the trust documents carefully. After a few minutes, she looked up. This is straightforward, she said. How so? The trust was created by your father. It was never combined with marital assets. So Greg has no claim. Carol shook her head. None at all. She tapped the paper. This money legally belongs to you and your son. How much is in the account right now? Carol checked the statement. $420,000. I nodded slowly. My father had built that money over years of careful investing. It had nothing to do with Greg. And it never would. Carol leaned forward slightly. Your husband thinks this is part of the divorce settlement. Yes. She raised an eyebrow. That misunderstanding could become significant. I smiled faintly. I believe it will. The following Friday night, Daniel had another soccer game. Late October in Iowa can be brutal. Cold wind whipped across the field and parents wrapped themselves in heavy coats. Daniel finished the game with grass stains on both knees and a tired grin. We stopped at Culver's afterward, a small tradition we'd started years earlier. The place smelled like burgers and frozen custard. We slid into a booth near the window. Daniel unwrapped his burger while watching cars pass outside. After a moment, he asked quietly, Dad called again today. What did he say? He asked if I wanted to go fishing next weekend. That sounds nice. Daniel shrugged. I said maybe. He took a bite of his burger, then looked up. Mom, does Dad really think he's winning this divorce? The question caught me off guard. Why would you say that? Daniel wiped ketchup from his fingers. Because he talks like he already did. I leaned back in the booth. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. He believes he made a good deal, I said. Daniel tilted his head. Did he? That depends on how you measure things. He thought about that. Then he said something that surprised me. He mentioned my college fund yesterday. I raised my eyebrows. What did he say? Daniel mimicked Greg's voice with a slight grin. Don't worry, son, your college is already taken care of. I almost laughed. Greg truly had no idea. Daniel studied my face. Mom, you know something, don't you? I took a sip of my iced tea. Your grandfather set up that trust for you, I said. I know. He made sure the paperwork was very clear. Daniel waited. And that money was never part of the marriage. Daniel blinked. So Dad can't touch it. Number. His eyes widened slightly. Then he leaned back in the booth. Oh. Just one word. But the meaning behind it was clear. After a moment he said quietly, so Dad's counting on money that isn't his. Yes. Daniel stared out the window for a long moment. Then he looked back at me. That's going to be awkward. I smiled. Yes, it is. Daniel shook his head slowly. Guess he should have read the fine print. Meanwhile, Greg continued planning his future. I heard about it through friends. Cedar Rapids isn't a huge city. People talk. Greg had been telling coworkers he might buy a fishing boat after the divorce. He'd even looked at one down in Coralville. 32 feet long. Bright white hull. Apparently he told a friend once the house sells and the accounts settle, I'll have plenty of room. That statement traveled through 2 people before reaching me. When I heard it, I simply nodded. Greg believed the house held enormous value. He believed the retirement funds were untouched. And most importantly, he believed the trust belonged to both of us. None of those assumptions were entirely correct. A week before the final hearing, Greg's lawyer called Linda Chavez. They wanted to review the final settlement documents. Linda and I met in her office that afternoon. She spread the paperwork across the desk. Everything looks exactly the way he requested, she said. House, vehicles, accounts, retirement funds. I nodded. And the trust I asked. Linda tapped the page. It isn't listed. Did they ask about it? She shook her head. Apparently not. Linda leaned back in her chair. You're aware that once this is signed, Greg assumes responsibility for the mortgage and the HELOC. Yes. And several credit cards in his name. I know. Linda watched me carefully. Ellen, this is one of the strangest divorce strategies I've ever seen. Strange how you're letting him walk away believing he won. I thought about Greg's voice on the phone. His plans for boats and early retirement. That belief won't last very long, I said. Linda closed the folder. Well, she said next Thursday morning is the final hearing. Lynn County Courthouse. 8:30. She paused. Are you ready? I considered the question. After months of quiet preparation, the moment was finally approaching. Yes, I said. I'm ready. The day before the hearing, Greg called again. He sounded almost cheerful. Big day tomorrow, he said. Yes? After this, we'll both be free. That's true. Greg hesitated for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. You know, Ellen, I really appreciate you not making this a fight. I leaned back in my chair. You're welcome. Most people would have dragged this through court for months. Probably. Greg chuckled. You always were the reasonable one. Reasonable. That was the word he chose. Not careful. Not patient. Just reasonable. Well, he said, finally, I'll see you tomorrow. Yes, I replied. You will. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long moment. Then I looked at the trust folder resting on the table. $420,000. Not mine. Not Greg's. Daniel's future. And Greg had never once asked about it. That silence was about to matter. A lot. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. The kind of Iowa morning where a thin mist hangs in the air and the sidewalks feel damp under your shoes. I parked outside the Lynn County Courthouse just before 8. The building stood quiet and solid against the cloudy sky. I had driven past it hundreds of times over the years, without ever imagining I would one day walk inside to end my marriage. But life has a way of surprising you. I took a slow breath before stepping out of the car. Inside the courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paperwork. The hallway echoed with the sound of footsteps and low conversations. Linda Chavez was already waiting near the courtroom doors. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "You look calmer than most people on their final divorce day." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just tired." "That happens too." We walked inside together. Greg was already there. He sat at the front table beside his attorney, Mark Dalton, wearing a dark blue suit I recognized from one of Daniel's middle school award ceremonies. Greg looked relaxed. Even confident. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. Not friendly. Not hostile. Just satisfied. Like a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. Mark Dalton shuffled through several folders on the table. He looked more serious than Greg, though I couldn't tell whether that was normal lawyer behavior or something else. The judge entered a few minutes later. Everyone stood. Then we sat again. The courtroom itself was small, maybe 20 wooden benches, most of them empty except for a few other people waiting for unrelated cases. The quiet in the room made every sound seem louder. The rustle of paper. The clearing of a throat. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents. "This is the matter of Parker versus Parker," he said. Linda spoke first. "Yes, Your Honor." Greg's lawyer nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge flipped through several pages. "I understand both parties have agreed to the settlement terms." Linda glanced at me. I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. Greg leaned back slightly in his chair. He looked completely comfortable. The judge began reviewing the agreement out loud. "The marital home located on Maple Grove Drive will be transferred to Mr. Gregory Parker." Greg's smile widened slightly. "The 2019 Ford Explorer and 2017 Honda Accord will be transferred to Mr. Parker." Greg tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "The joint retirement accounts will be transferred to Mr. Parker." His lawyer made a small note on his legal pad. "The primary investment account will be transferred to Mr. Parker." Greg's shoulders relaxed further. From the outside, it probably looked like he was winning the lottery. Then the judge reached the final section of paperwork. That was when something changed. Mark Dalton leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor," he said carefully. The judge looked up. "Yes, Mr. Dalton. There appears to be one financial account not addressed in the settlement documents." The room went quiet. Greg frowned slightly. "What account?" he whispered. Dalton flipped through his folder. "The Parker Educational Trust." Greg blinked. "Oh, that." He waved a hand dismissively. "That's ours." Dalton didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked across the table toward Linda Chavez. Linda remained calm. She opened a thin folder and slid a document toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "the trust in question was created by Ellen Parker's father 14 years ago." The judge adjusted his glasses again and read the page. Greg shifted in his seat. "Yeah, but it's part of the family finances," he said. Linda shook her head. "No, Mr. Parker, it isn't." She pointed to the document. "The legal beneficiaries listed are Ellen Parker and Daniel Parker." Greg leaned forward. So Linda continued calmly, "Mr. Parker was never listed as a beneficiary or owner of the trust." For a moment, Greg didn't react. He just stared at the paper like he was trying to translate a foreign language. Then he looked at his lawyer. "What does that mean?" Dalton rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It means the trust isn't marital property." Greg's forehead wrinkled. "That doesn't make sense." Dalton lowered his voice. "Greg, that account legally belongs to Ellen and Daniel." Greg's head snapped toward me. "What?" The judge cleared his throat. "According to these documents, the trust was established by Ms. Parker's father and has remained separate from marital assets." Greg's face started losing color. "How much is in that account?" the judge asked. Linda answered calmly. $420,000. You could hear someone shift on one of the benches behind us. Greg's mouth opened slightly. "That money was supposed to be part of the settlement," he said. Linda shook her head again. "It never was." Greg turned to his lawyer. "You told me that account was ours." Dalton exhaled slowly. "I asked if it was marital property. You said yes." Greg's voice rose. "Well, of course I did." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Parker, please lower your voice." Greg turned toward me again. "Ellen, you knew about this." I met his eyes calmly. Yes. The silence in the room grew heavier. Greg's chair scraped slightly against the floor as he leaned closer to Dalton. Okay, he whispered urgently. Fine. The trust stays with her. Whatever. Dalton didn't answer. Instead, he opened another folder and stared at several pages. His expression changed. Greg, he said quietly. Greg frowned. What? Dalton lowered his voice even further. You're responsible for the mortgage. I know that. And the HELOC. Greg blinked. What about it? Dalton hesitated. Then he said the words that had opened this entire story. Greg, with the mortgage, the line of credit, and the cards in your name, you didn't gain $1 million. Greg stared at him. You inherited almost $1 million in debt. Greg's smile vanished. Completely. What are you talking about? He whispered. Dalton slid the financial summary toward him. Look. Greg studied the paper. 30 seconds passed. Then his face drained of color. That can't be right. Dalton didn't respond. Greg turned toward me again. You tricked me. The judge immediately spoke. Mr. Parker, the settlement was voluntarily agreed upon by both parties. Greg ignored him. You knew about the debt. Yes, I said. And you let me take the house anyway. Yes. Greg sat there frozen. For the first time in 23 years, he looked completely unsure of himself. Dalton leaned closer again. The house has equity, he whispered, but the HELOC wiped most of it out. If you sell right now, you barely break even. Greg whispered something I couldn't hear. Dalton shook his head slowly. Then the judge cleared his throat. Are there any objections to the settlement agreement? Linda looked at me. I nodded. No objections, Your Honor, she said. The judge looked at Greg. Dalton answered for him. No objections. Greg didn't say a word. The judge signed the documents. Very well, the divorce is finalized. I picked up the pen Linda handed me and signed my name. Ellen Parker. 23 years reduced to a single signature. Greg stared at the table in front of him. Before leaving the courtroom, I looked at him once more. You got exactly what you wanted, I said quietly. And for the first time that morning, Greg didn't smile. Life got quiet after the divorce. Not empty, just calm. The kind of calm you don't notice at first because you've spent so many years living inside noise. Arguments about money. Complaints about work. Greg's late-night phone calls about one more investment opportunity. All of it disappeared. And the silence that replaced it felt unfamiliar at first. Daniel and I stayed in the house for about 6 weeks while the paperwork finished processing. Greg technically owned it now, but he hadn't figured out what to do yet. One Saturday morning in November, Daniel and I packed the last of our things into my Subaru. Not much, honestly. Clothes, some books, a few boxes of kitchen stuff. The bigger furniture stayed. Greg had insisted on keeping it. As Daniel carried a box down the front steps, he looked back at the house. You sure about this? He asked. I followed his gaze. 23 years of memories sat behind that front door. But the place didn't feel like mine anymore. I'm sure, I said. He nodded. Okay. Our new place wasn't far away. A small townhouse on the west side of Cedar Rapids, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a narrow porch in front. Nothing fancy. But the mortgage was manageable. And the place felt peaceful. The first night we slept there, I noticed something strange. I slept all the way through the night. No waking up at 3 a.m. worrying about bills. No listening for Greg stumbling in late. Just quiet. The kind that lets your mind finally rest. Greg, on the other hand, had a different experience. At first, he sounded confident when he called Daniel. He talked about listing the house soon. Mentioned meeting with a realtor. Even joked about finally buying that boat. But over the next few weeks, the tone of those calls slowly changed. One evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table doing homework when his phone rang. He answered. Hey, Dad. I tried not to listen, but the room was small. There was a long pause. Then Daniel said, Yeah, Mom told me about that. Another pause. Then he said quietly, That sounds rough. A few minutes later, he hung up. What happened? I asked. Daniel shrugged. He's having trouble with the house payments. I didn't act surprised. Greg had taken responsibility for the mortgage, the HELOC, 3 credit cards, and a car loan. All of it added up quickly. What did he say? I asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He thought selling the house would solve everything. I nodded slowly. Did it? Daniel shook his head. He said the realtor told him there isn't much equity left after the loans. That sounded about right. Daniel stared down at his math worksheet for a moment. Then he looked up. Mom, did you know that would happen? I considered the question carefully. Yes, I said. Daniel nodded. Yeah, I figured. Winter arrived early that year. By December, the sidewalks were covered in snow, and the wind coming off the Cedar River felt like knives against your face. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel and I drove past our old neighborhood. The trip wasn't intentional. We had just gone to the grocery store and took a wrong turn. But as we passed Maple Grove Drive, Daniel leaned forward in his seat. Look. I slowed the car. Our old house stood at the end of the block. And there, planted firmly in the front yard, was a large sign. For sale. Daniel stared at it for a moment. Guess the boat's on hold, he said. I couldn't help smiling. Probably. We drove on. No anger. No bitterness. Just closure. Spring came a few months later. Daniel worked hard in school that year. Soccer, classes, college applications. By April, he had an acceptance letter from Iowa State University sitting on our kitchen table. He opened it slowly. Then he looked up at me with a grin I hadn't seen in months. I got in. I hugged him. I never doubted it. Daniel laughed. Dad called about that. Oh. He asked how I was paying for tuition. And what did you tell him? Daniel shrugged. I said Grandpa planned ahead. That was true. The Parker Education Trust paid Daniel's tuition without a problem. Exactly as my father intended. Exactly as Greg had overlooked. Greg called me once. Just once. It was late on a Tuesday evening in May. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Hello? His voice sounded tired. Ellen. Hi, Greg. There was a pause. Then he sighed. I might lose the house. I didn't say anything. Greg continued. I didn't realize how much debt was attached to it. Another pause. I guess I should have looked closer. Yes, I said. You probably should have. Greg let out a small, humorless laugh. You knew, didn't you? Yes. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about that question. 23 years of marriage. Hundreds of conversations. Thousands of small decisions. And one final moment in a courtroom. You asked for everything I said gently. Greg didn't reply. After a moment, he said, Daniel seems happy. He is? That's good. We sat in silence for a few seconds. Then Greg said quietly, Take care, Ellen. You too. The call ended. And that was the last time we spoke. These days, my life is simple. Daniel moved into his dorm at Iowa State that fall. The townhouse feels quieter without him, but in a good way. Some evenings I sit on the front porch with a cup of tea and watch the sunset over the street. Neighbors walk their dogs. Kids ride bikes down the sidewalk. Normal life. Peaceful life. Greg once believed winning meant collecting things. The house. The cars. The accounts. But time has a way of teaching different lessons. The most valuable things I kept weren't on any financial statement. My son's future. My peace of mind. And the quiet knowledge that sometimes the strongest move a person can make is simply stepping aside. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to walk away from something unfair, remember this. Dignity is never a loss. And patience has a way of letting the truth reveal itself. Thank you for listening.